Amosi was born into a world of silence. From the moment she took her first breath, her mother had already taken her last. Left with a cruel stepmother, Bimpo, she never knew love or kindness. In the small, isolated village where she grew up, no one spoke out and no one interfered with what went on behind closed doors. The village was peaceful on the outside, but it was steeped in traditions that held women like Amosi in chains. As a little girl, she quickly learned that her voice was not a gift, it was a curse. Whenever she dared to speak, even to ask for food or a moment of rest, Bimpo would punish her, telling her, "Silence is your strength, learn it, live it, and survive." With every punishment, Amosi grew quieter, believing that her silence was all she had to protect herself in a world that seemed to devour the weak. The village people, too, were complicit in the silence. They saw her, but they didn't really see her. They didn't dare intervene in the affairs of the Koro family, no matter how much they whispered behind closed doors. Amosi's quiet existence was as constant as the sun setting over the dry, dusty landscape of their world. She was a girl who had learned to survive not by raising her voice, but by keeping it locked away. At the age of 16, Amosi's life, which had already been filled with silence and hardship, took an even darker turn. The elders of her village, bound by old traditions, arranged a marriage for her to Koro, a man from a neighboring village known for his harshness. Amosi had no say in the matter. It was simply a transaction, a way to keep the Koro family bloodline alive. For Amosi, it felt like the final step in a life that had already been decided for her. A life where her dreams, her hopes, and even her voice were never meant to exist. She had no idea what it meant to marry someone, let alone to marry a man she had never met. The day she left her childhood home, the weight of her new life pressed down on her chest like a heavy stone. When Amosi arrived at her new home, she was greeted not with warmth, but with the cold, unfeeling presence of Mama Dende, her new mother-in-law. Mama Dende was a woman whose cruelty had no bounds. From the first moment Amosi stepped into her new home, she was treated like nothing more than a servant. Mama Dende made it clear that Amosi's purpose was to work. From sunup to sundown, there was no time to rest. She was expected to help in the fields, carry heavy water jugs from the well, and cook meals for the family. She barely had enough time to sleep, let alone eat. The food she was given was sparse, and most of it was stale. If she made a mistake, like burning the porridge or missing a spot in the house, she would be scolded harshly and sometimes even hit. But the worst part of it all wasn't the work, the hunger, or the physical pain. It was the utter silence with which she was surrounded. No one spoke to her with kindness. Her husband, Koro, didn't even look at her. His mother, Mama Dende, treated her like a shadow, something that was there only to serve. Amosi was alone in a house full of people, and her life seemed to be one long series of empty days. The silence she had learned to embrace as a child became her only companion. At least it was safe. At least it protected her from the constant insults and cruelty. The more she stayed silent, the less Mama Dende seemed to notice her. She would go days without being spoken to, other than being ordered to do chores. Koro never defended her. He didn't even seem to care that his mother treated his new wife like a slave. Amosi began to wonder if this was all there was to life: endless labor, hunger, and isolation. As the months passed, the dreams she once had as a little girl seemed more and more distant. They were like a forgotten story that she no longer had the strength to remember. The only escape Amosi had was to go deeper into the silence, to lose herself in the world inside her mind. When everyone was asleep, she would sneak out to the quiet corners of the yard or the small dark room she'd been given, and she would let herself feel something, even if it was just the faintest whisper of hope. But even that felt like a distant memory. The only thing that mattered now was survival, not just physically, but emotionally. Amosi learned to be small, to be unseen, and to keep her pain buried deep within her. She had no choice but to endure, day after day, hoping for a change that she didn't believe would ever come. The village, which had once been her home, now seemed like a faraway dream. The people who once whispered about her beauty or her kindness had long since forgotten her. She was just another girl, another woman in a long line of women who were born to work and suffer in silence. Amosi's reality was now her prison. Her stepmother's cruel words had been replaced by Mama Dende's cold indifference, and the silence that had once been a shield now felt like a cage. She had become a shadow in her own life, and the only thing that could truly set her free was a strength that had not yet awoken within her. Amosi never asked for this life. She didn't choose it, but in the deepest part of her heart, she still held on to a small, fragile hope that someday, somehow, she would be more than just a servant. It wasn't that she expected things to get better. She had stopped expecting anything at all. But somewhere in the corners of her mind, she still remembered the girl she used to be. The girl who dreamed of a life where she could be free, where her voice could be heard. Even in the silence, that girl was still there, waiting. Amosi's suffering became deeper with every passing day. Each morning, she woke up on the hard, cold ground outside the house, her thin blanket barely protecting her from the chill of the night. The dew would soak her skin before the sun even rose. And yet, no one cared. Not her husband, not Mama Dende. It was as if her pain didn't exist to them, as if she was invisible. They saw her only when they needed something, and even then, only to order or punish her. The village passed by, busy with their lives, never stopping to ask why the young girl with the hollow eyes was never smiling. Her life was filled with burdens far too heavy for someone so small. She was made to carry large bundles of firewood from the deep forest, often walking barefoot over thorns and rocks. Her arms would tremble, her back would ache, but if she paused to rest, Mama Dende's harsh voice would cut through the air, shaming her for being weak. And Koro, her husband, stood by watching, always silent, never stepping in. His silence was not like hers. His was full of choice, full of cruelty. He was silent because he didn't care. Inside Amosi, there were storms. Her heart was full of unspoken words, uncried tears, and pain too big to name. But she couldn't let any of it out. Her voice had become something she feared. What if she spoke and no one listened? What if her words only brought more punishment? So she kept it all inside, like a flame locked behind glass, burning in silence. Mama Dende would often laugh and say, "She's a girl without a voice. That's why the gods sent her to us, to work, not to speak." Those words cut deeper than any wound, but Amosi never replied. Her silence, once forced, now became a shield, the only thing she had left to protect herself. The villagers never asked questions. They saw her carry heavy baskets, limp from bruised legs, and keep her eyes low when others looked her way. But no one said anything. The old women would shake their heads. The younger girls would whisper behind hands, but no one helped. In a place ruled by customs, her suffering was just another tradition. A girl married off, treated like nothing, expected to bear it all. But there was one place where Amosi could breathe, the riverbank. After the sun had set and the village was quiet, she would walk there alone. The river didn't ask her questions. It didn't laugh or hurt her. It just listened. She would kneel by the water, dip her fingers into its cool surface, and whisper her pain, softly, so no one would hear. She told the river everything, how tired she was, how much her body ached, how much she wished for someone to see her. The river became her only friend, the only one who knew the real Amosi. And though the river never spoke back, its gentle flow made her feel a little less alone. Each day, Amosi returned to the house with her heart slightly lighter, but her body heavier. The weight of silence, of carrying grief with no name, never truly left. She had forgotten what it felt like to laugh, to speak freely, or to be loved. Every time Mama Dende called her names, every time Koro turned his back, she reminded herself, if she could survive one more day, maybe one day, she would be more than this shadow. Amosi never fought back, not because she was weak, but because she didn't know how. The world had never taught her to fight. It had only taught her to endure. So she did, one breath at a time, one step, one silent prayer to the river. Every drop of water that passed over her fingers carried a piece of her pain. Maybe someday the river would carry it far enough that someone would finally listen. After enduring endless pain and quiet suffering, a small spark of hope lit up inside Amosi. She was pregnant. For the first time in her life, she felt something close to joy. The tiny life growing inside her made her feel seen, even if no one else noticed. She would sit by the river and hold her stomach, whispering to the baby growing inside her, telling it stories she never got to hear herself. She dreamed that this child would change everything. Maybe Mama Dende would treat her better. Maybe Koro would finally look at her, speak to her. Maybe the silence would end. As the months passed, she held on to this hope tightly, even though her body was still pushed to its limits. She was not given rest. She was not cared for. Still, Amosi endured it all because she believed her child would bring light to her dark world. Every kick she felt was like a promise that she wasn't alone anymore. She imagined a small, soft cry breaking the heavy silence in the house, finally giving her something to live for. But fate was cruel. One morning, after days of pain and exhaustion, Amosi collapsed near the river. The villagers rushed to her, and for the first time, people actually noticed her. But it was too late. The baby was gone. The child was born without breath, and Amosi's world shattered completely. She lay in silence, staring at the sky, feeling as if the last piece of her soul had been taken. Her arms were empty, and so was everything else. The one thing that had given her hope had slipped away, and there was no one to hold her, no one to say, "I'm sorry." Instead, Mama Dende stood above her, her voice sharp and cruel. "You brought death into this house," she spat. "You are cursed. Even your womb rejects you." The words struck deeper than any slap. There was no grief from Koro, no mourning from the family, just blame, just cold eyes and whispers that spread quickly through the village. Mama Dende's words poisoned the minds of everyone. The villagers who once pitied her now looked at her with fear. They stopped speaking to her, avoided her path, and pulled their children away if she came too close. To them, she was no longer just a girl without a voice. She was a woman who brought death, a curse wrapped in skin. They didn't care how much she had suffered. They didn't want to hear her side. They believed what was easiest to believe, that the silent girl had brought tragedy upon herself. Amosi became a ghost in her own life. Her steps grew slower, her body weaker, and her eyes emptier. She no longer whispered to the river. Even that felt pointless now. The silence that had once protected her, that she thought was her only safe place, began to feel like a punishment. She started to wonder if Mama Dende had been right all along. Maybe she was cursed. Maybe her voice had no power because she didn't deserve one. The girl who once dreamed of love, of being seen and heard, now barely had the strength to dream at all. She would sit for hours staring into nothing, feeling the weight of her emptiness pressing on her chest. Her hands would rest on her stomach out of habit, then quickly fall away. There was nothing there now, nothing inside her but silence and sorrow. And no matter how loudly her heart screamed, the world remained deaf to her pain. Amosi didn't cry. She couldn't. The tears felt too loud, so she stayed quiet, just like always, letting the silence swallow her whole. That night, the moon hung heavy and full in the sky, casting silver light over the quiet village. But inside Amosi's world, there was no light, only darkness. Mama Dende had been more cruel than usual, throwing words sharper than knives and striking blows that left deep bruises, not just on her skin, but on her spirit. The weight of it all was unbearable. The silence that had always been her shield now felt like a prison cell, and something inside her had reached its breaking point. Her feet moved on their own, guiding her toward the one place that had ever brought her peace, the river. The path was quiet as she walked, the cold night air brushing against her skin like a soft warning. Her body ached with every step, but her heart ached more. When she reached the riverbank, she didn't sit like she usually did. She didn't dip her hands in gently or whisper softly. This time, she fell to her knees and stared at the rushing water. And then, something inside her snapped. Her lips parted, and from the depth of her chest came a sound that had been buried for years. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't a whisper. It was a scream, raw, broken, full of every untold story she had ever locked away. She screamed into the night, into the river, into the wind. She screamed for the mother she never knew, for the stepmother who taught her pain, for the husband who never saw her, for the child she lost, and for the silence that had stolen her life. She poured it all out, not just with her voice, but with her soul. Her heart spoke in a language no one had ever heard from her before. Every moment of injustice, every bruise, every tear, every word she had been too afraid to say, it all came out in a flood. The river didn't just listen, it responded. Its waters began to ripple harder, faster, as though it was taking in her pain, drinking it and carrying it away. The surface danced wildly under the moonlight, reflecting the fire that had finally awakened in Amosi. As she knelt there, exhausted from the outpouring, she noticed how the river seemed to come alive. It was no longer just water. It was a force, a witness. It moved with a power that seemed to reach beyond her. The current pulled harder, louder, as if echoing her pain, carrying it downstream, not just away from her, but out into the world. The same villagers who had ignored her, the elders who arranged her marriage, even strangers far beyond the hills. She didn't know how, but she felt the river taking her story to them. Her truth, once buried, was now being released into the world. And in that moment, for the first time in her life, Amosi felt lighter. Her body was still weak, her life still uncertain, but something had changed. She had spoken, she had screamed, and something had heard her. The river, her only friend, had carried her voice when she could no longer carry it herself. And somewhere deep inside, she realized she wasn't just the girl without a voice anymore. She was the girl who survived long enough to be heard. The morning after Amosi's scream at the river, the village woke to an eerie silence. But not from Amosi this time. Mama Dende, the woman whose voice had once echoed through the fields and homes, demanding, insulting, shouting orders and curses, was now silent, completely. She opened her mouth to speak, to call for Koro, to complain about something as she always did, but nothing came out, no sound, not even a whisper. Her throat moved, her lips formed words, but they were empty, soundless. At first, she thought it was temporary. She drank water, she tried again, still nothing. Panic crept into her eyes. Her hands waved in frustration. She hit her chest as if trying to knock her voice back into existence. But the more she tried, the more her throat ached. It felt as though something deep inside her had dried up, sealed shut. The voice that had controlled the house, that had broken Amosi down over and over again, was gone. The news spread quickly through the village. People gathered outside the Koro household, whispering behind hands and under their breath. It must be a curse, some said. The gods have spoken, said others. Mama Denda has lost her tongue for the pain she gave that girl. Suspicion filled the air like smoke. They remembered Amosi's stillborn child, the way Mama Denda had blamed her, how cruel she had been. And now, the same woman who silenced others had become voiceless herself. Even the elders came to see her. They watched as she tried to explain, to scream, to make a sound, but her voice had vanished. Her hands trembled, her face twisted in rage, but it only made her look more powerless. Mama Dende had ruled with her voice, and now, with nothing left to shout, she was just an old, bitter woman with no power. The villagers began to look at Amosi differently. She hadn't said a word. She hadn't told anyone about the river or the scream. But something in her eyes had changed. She no longer looked like a broken girl. There was a stillness to her now, a quiet power that couldn't be ignored. Where Mama Dende's voice had once brought fear, Amosi's silence now brought mystery. The same silence that had once been her curse was now her armor. People began to whisper that perhaps the river had heard her cries and answered. Amosi did not smile. She didn't gloat or boast. She simply went about her day, her head no longer lowered. When she walked through the village, people stepped aside, not out of pity, but out of quiet respect. Something had shifted. The woman who was once a shadow now had a presence that filled every space she entered, not with words, but with the quiet strength of someone who had survived everything. Mama Dende sat in her hut, trying to write her orders down, but no one rushed to serve her anymore. The fear she once inspired was gone. Without her voice, she was just another person, and for the first time, she felt what it meant to be ignored, dismissed, forgotten. Amosi's silence, the same silence that once made her invisible, had become a language of its own, a story of pain, of endurance, and now of quiet revenge. The village listened to her, not with their ears, but with their hearts. And without ever speaking a word, Amosi had finally been heard. As days passed, Mama Dende's silence became heavier. Her condition did not improve. If anything, it worsened. Her frustration turned into isolation. She could no longer give orders, shout insults, or control anyone around her. The woman who once ruled with her voice now sat alone, ignored and powerless. The same villagers who once feared her began to whisper about her cruelty. They remembered the way she treated Amosi, the pain she caused without shame, and how her harsh voice once filled the air like smoke choking everyone. But now, it was Amosi's silence that filled the village. Not with fear, but with something else. Peace. She did not gloat or speak ill of Mama Dende. She did not celebrate her fall. Instead, she continued her life with quiet strength, carrying herself with calm and dignity, and the village noticed. Slowly, people began coming to her, not out of pity, but out of respect. Mothers asked her to bless their daughters. Elders invited her to sit near them. Children sat at her feet, comforted by her presence. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence had become her voice, a voice of patience, of strength, of survival. It told the story of a girl who had lost everything, her childhood, her baby, her place in the world, but still stood tall. Her silence had once been forced on her, but now it was her power. The community started seeing the truth clearly. It wasn't Amosi who was cursed. It was Mama Dende, cursed by her own hatred, her own cruelty. And now that her voice was gone, her power faded. No one stood by her. Even Koro, her son, avoided her shame-filled eyes. She had built a throne on fear, and now that fear was gone, the throne collapsed. The elders too began to look at Amosi in a new light. She had endured more than most, and never asked for revenge. She didn't seek justice through anger, but through grace. She had let the river carry her pain, and in return, it had brought her strength. Now, her silence echoed louder than any scream. Amosi had become more than a girl without a voice. She had become a symbol, a quiet rebellion against cruelty, a gentle reminder that sometimes the strongest voice is the one that doesn't need to shout. One afternoon, as the sun burned low in the sky, Mama Dende stumbled out of her hut, her face twisted with rage and desperation. Her voice still gone, her hands shook as she pointed at Amosi, her eyes full of fire. She marched toward her, her steps uneven but driven by fury. The villagers watched from a distance, unsure of what she would do. Her mouth moved furiously, forming words no one could hear. She demanded answers, blamed Amosi with silent screams, her arms waving wildly, as if her fury alone could bring her voice back. Amosi stood still. She didn't flinch, didn't move away. Her eyes met Mama Dende's with calm strength. There was no fear in her gaze, no hate, no pride, just silence, steady, quiet, and powerful. It was a silence that spoke more than words ever could. It told a story of suffering, of survival, and of quiet resistance. And as Mama Dende stood before her, trying to force a reaction, Amosi gave her nothing but that same silent strength. Something inside Mama Dende seemed to crack at that moment. Her hands dropped to her sides. Her knees trembled. For a second, she looked lost, like a person who had just realized they were no longer feared, no longer in control. The rage in her face faded into confusion, then into fear. She tried to shout again, but her voice betrayed her. And then, right there in front of the village, she collapsed onto the ground. The villagers rushed to her. Koro came running, along with the elders. They lifted her up, but she was weak and trembling, her eyes wild and empty. She tried to speak, but there was nothing. No words, no strength. Her time as the powerful matriarch was over. The crowd that once obeyed her every word now looked at her with pity. Through all of this, Amosi did not move. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She stood still, her hands calm at her side, her gaze steady. Her silence wrapped around her like armor. And though she didn't say a single word, everyone felt the shift. The power that once belonged to Mama Dende now rested with the girl she tried to silence. The wind moved gently through the trees. The villagers looked at Amosi not as a broken girl anymore, but as a woman who had quietly defeated cruelty with nothing but grace. It had been months since Mama Dende had lost her voice. Her days were now filled with silence and shadows, and her world had grown small. She no longer walked through the village like a queen. Her eyes, once sharp with judgment, now seemed dull and afraid. People no longer turned to her for anything. They barely looked at her. The voice that once ruled the household, that struck fear into everyone, was gone. And in that silence, she was forced to feel every bit of pain she had caused. But one morning, as the rains finally came and the river swelled with life again, something changed. Mama Dende sat alone near her doorway, staring at the sky when she coughed, soft at first, then again. Her throat trembled, and finally a sound came out. It wasn't the loud, commanding voice she once had. It was a hoarse, broken whisper, as if her own voice had been dragged through the same suffering she had made others feel. She tried to say more, but every word felt heavy and weak. Her voice had returned, but it no longer held any power. The villagers heard of it quickly, but no one feared her now. They saw her not as someone cursed, but someone judged. And they all knew who had brought about the change, not with spells or words, but with quiet strength. Amosi stood not far away, carrying a pot of water from the river. She had not spoken a single word through all of this. Yet she didn't need to. Her silence had already changed everything. She was no longer the girl who walked with her head down. The village had watched her survive heartbreak, pain, cruelty, and never once did she turn bitter. Her quiet had not been weakness. It had been strength waiting for the right time to rise. Children followed her when she walked. Women sought her presence when they needed peace. Even the elders nodded respectfully as she passed. Her silence had built something powerful, something no loud voice ever could. It was as if the river itself had carried her cries into the wind and returned her power in silence. She had never cursed Mama Dende, never spoken against her, but the river had heard, and it had answered. Mama Dende now looked at Amosi with a different kind of silence, one filled with shame. She knew now that her own fall had come, not because of a curse, but because of her own actions. And in the end, it wasn't Amosi's voice that defeated her, it was her refusal to break. The river kept flowing, just as it always had, calm, strong, eternal. And in its flow was a lesson that everyone remembered. Sometimes the loudest noise is not what changes the world, but the quiet that refuses to disappear. Amosi had never raised her voice, but her silence had changed a village, broken a cruel woman, and reminded everyone that true strength doesn't always need to be heard. Years passed, but the memory of Amosi never faded from the village. Her presence, her silence, her strength became part of the land, part of the river, part of every whisper in the wind. She never asked for recognition, never demanded justice, but her quiet courage had changed everything. The village no longer saw silence as weakness. Instead, they began to teach their daughters that silence could be strength if it held truth, pain, and survival within it. Amosi, though she spoke little, became a quiet guide for many women. She never led with loud words, but with calm hands, steady eyes, and a heart that had endured more than most could imagine. Young girls began to gather near her, sitting with her by the riverbank, where she would hum soft tunes, touch their hair gently, and teach them about patience, about strength, about knowing their worth even if the world tried to take their voice. And the river, oh, the river became something more. It was no longer just a place to fetch water, it was a sacred place now. People began to call it Amosi's River. They said the waters had once carried a girl's pain and returned her strength, that it listened even when the world didn't. Women would come there to pray, to cry, to find peace. They said if you sat by the river long enough, it would carry your pain too. Years turned into decades, generations came and went. The village grew, and so did the legend of the girl who had suffered in silence and changed everything without raising her voice. Her story was told at night around fires, to children with wide eyes, but it was not told with pity, it was told with pride. And one day, a young girl sat by the river, her feet in the cool water. She sang a song so soft it barely touched the air. The song was her own, but the melody, it was Amosi's. passed down like a secret strength from one heart to another. Her voice floated across the surface of the water, and the river rippled gently, as if listening again. In that moment, it was clear. Amosi's voice had never truly disappeared. It had simply changed form. It now lived in the river, in the hush of the trees, in every girl who dared to be strong in her own quiet way. Her silence had not been the end. It had been the beginning of a new voice for generations to come.